I was able to play Legends of Equestria for the first time this weekend. During both of the previous open testing weekends, I was unable to log in thanks to client server issues. I'd heard mixed reviews from friends who managed to make it into the game, so when I logged in this past weekend, I was cautiously optimistic that many of the previous issues had been addressed. I put in several hours at this point, over 7 hours with recorded video and a few hours without. I didn't complete the quests, but I think I have a fairly decent grasp of the game. Yes, I'm aware that this is an alpha, and some would say it's unfair to critique things that are buggy, incomplete, or not fully implemented. On the other hand, I know what development hell looks like, and I also know that issues can't be addressed and fixed if they aren't being brought up. If you're one of the LOE apologists who thinks that the game is perfect, that the developers shit potpourri, and that anyone who says a single word against the game is a troll, kindly turn off this video, destroy your computer with a sledgehammer, and come to the realization that you are actively preventing this game from reaching its full potential. Good, now that they're finally gone. I'm going to begin with what I consider to be the major flaws in the current iteration. Flaws that impact every single aspect of the game. From talking with other players, I know that these are not new problems, so it's time that someone pointed them out. First off, the controls are god-awful. Anyone who plays first-person shooters on PC wants to use the mouse to control their movement, direction, and vision. But this is impossible in LOE unless you're pressing the right mouse button. So basically, anytime you move and you want to have fine control over your movement, which is always, you're required to hold down the right mouse button. That's just plain idiotic. The only times I wasn't holding down the right mouse button while moving were on those rare occasions that I could travel in a perfectly straight line for long distances. And even then, out of habit, I was often still pressing the right mouse button. Why is mouse look not a toggle option? Why is this not the default setting? Without mouse look, auto-targeting is essential, but of course it doesn't work at the moment. Assuming that targeting did work, I would still need to put the intended target close to the center of my field of vision, and what's the best way to do that? With the inconvenient mouse controls. Second, even when holding the right mouse button, movement is problematic in tight spaces thanks to the complete lack of strafing. Strafing in the context of shooters means lateral movement. This is essential for smooth transitions around corners. Otherwise, your view is limited to the tangent line of the curve you're walking. This is a death sentence if there's anything hostile around the corner. It also means that exploring tight spaces requires constantly stopping to pan the field of view to areas you can't see while in motion. At times, this had some hilarious consequences, such as players not being able to spot me despite running right past me during a game of hide and seek. More often, this was just annoying and made it a pain to navigate around corners. Also, this is not strafing. The third major flaw is the camera. Why anyone thought that having a lazy chase cam would be a good idea, I simply can't imagine. Here I'm trying to navigate through tunnels in the cave, but I literally have no idea if I'm going to clear the corner because I can't see where I'm going. I only see what my character should have been looking at about half a second ago. The only reason I was able to clear any of these corners was due to luck and good guesses, not skill. And even though I cleared some of the corners, I wasn't able to see what I was flying past because the camera kept staring at the walls. I won't attempt to estimate how many times I ended up stopped dead in my tracks on a wall or map object because I couldn't see because the camera was trailing behind me. Maybe this is an attempt to force players to use the first-person mode, but that would be a really odd choice in a game that obviously favors the third-person view. In contrast, let's look at a game that handles these same issues perfectly. In Mount and Blade Warband, I can strafe around corners. This means that I can see where I'm going before I get there without having to stop moving and reposition myself. I'm not holding down the right mouse button, so I'm not getting carpal tunnel syndrome from simply walking around town. And the camera is tightly fixed to my character's field of view. Here I feel in control of my character. In contrast, this is shithouse. The last of the major flaws, which is only a major flaw because the game is so heavily focused on socializing, is the chat system. This is painfully obvious, so I'm not going to explain why it's stupid to force players to constantly switch between chat tabs to see messages. Instead, I'm just going to say there should be a single output window with all of the text, optionally filterable, and you should be able to select which channel you speak into. Okay, so let's get to some of the things that the game does exceptionally well. The pony models look great, and the random generator will periodically create a pony that looks quite decent even by show standards. I used the random generator to sample a variety of styles, stopped when I saw one that I thought looked really nice, and made a few minor tweaks to round it out. Doesn't she look great? Even her name was randomly generated and seemed to fit perfectly, a few minor color edits and cutie mark notwithstanding. Speaking of pony appearance, the shadow effect around the edges looks very nice and really gives the 3D models that friendship is magic appearance, where the borders are shaded slightly darker than the base colors. My one complaint regarding the pony creator, and this is a very minor complaint, is that many of the available cutie marks don't fit the style of the show. And my immediate thought when seeing these cutie marks was, bad OC. The world and the models within it look absolutely amazing. But in order to get the full effect, you will need to crank up the video settings to whatever your rig can handle. My recordings ended up with odd sampling effects, but the game itself looks 1,000 times better, especially at night. As a player, you can't help but get the feeling that you're actually in Equestria. The buildings fit the style of the show, the colors are rich, and in short, the environment is spot on. To the modeling and map design teams, bravo, and keep up the good work. The music also seemed fitting, but unfortunately I spent most of the game with the music turned off to make editing easier, so I can't say much else about it. And now some more issues. My first impressions of the game, aside from immediately glitching due to wonky controls and strafe not working, were dominated by confusion. In most games there's a hook to get you involved, to give you some idea of what your goals are, and make you care about achieving those goals. In LOE, you're just kind of there. And sure, maybe the developers want to add that sort of thing once the other systems are fleshed out, but from an RP perspective, I've got just as much reason to talk to all the NPCs as I do to stand on top of a column and dance for no reason. It's pretty much the first rule of RPGs that you should talk to everyone. In LOE, there is no plot, but you're still expected to talk to all of the NPCs and complete the quests. It took me a little over an hour to completely explore Cantermere and talk to all of the NPCs. Due to strafing not working, camera issues, the gigantic map, NPCs not being indicated in any way, and various bugs with the game, I figured out early on that the most efficient way to talk to NPCs is to float a quarter-mile away and click on targets below while sweeping across the city. This is incredibly boring. But thanks to not being able to control my character's movement properly, this is the only 100% foolproof way to be sure I haven't missed any NPCs. Floating overhead, it seemed pretty obvious that the NPCs were laid out by street corners. Street corner 1A had an NPC, street corner 3F had an NPC, and so on. But when one NPC sends you to go talk to another one, there's no correlation to speak of. Had I known that I was expected to memorize each and every NPC, I would have been taking notes while scouring the city. But since I didn't take notes, I had no alternative but to go back and talk to every single NPC all over again. I was already so bored with Cantermere that after my first sweep plus an additional 20 minutes trying to find NPCs whose locations I didn't remember, I left without completing a single quest. In most games, the assumption is that if an NPC has a name, then that NPC is important. The flavor text in LOE indicated that this was not the case, because every pony has a name, and therefore names are meaningless and not correlated with importance. Often I had a pony tell me something to indicate that I was on a quest, but because the quest listing doesn't work, I had no idea if I had actually received the quest or not, or even what to do next. After Cantermere, I was so fed up with the NPCs that I stopped reading anything an NPC had to say unless it had a text tree. Let's take Mountain Blade Warband again as an example. Here I know which NPCs are the important ones because they're the only ones who aren't walking around. In Star Wars The Old Republic, it's even more obvious. The flavor text is part of the narrative, so you aren't even able to talk to the unimportant NPCs. And yes, I know the devs have put a lot of time and effort into making their brilliant one-liners, so of course, as a player, I should be forced to track down and talk to every single NPC in existence. But there are better ways to implement this sort of thing which don't make it so tedious. If you've played LOE for a while, then you already know which NPCs you don't need to talk to, but if you're new, as I was, this is not the case. A whopping 2.5 hours after first joining the game, I finally came across my first enemy, and Bambi kicked the shit out of me. I respawned in an unfamiliar location, and flew back out into the wilderness in an attempt to find my critically wounded yet somehow invincible nemesis. What I found was even better, a lone wolf, surely an easy target. I died within a second against this wolf due to the 3 other wolves inconspicuously stacked underneath it. My next target was a group of timber wolves, which for some reason were unable to hurt me. I determined that enemies fall into 2 categories, those that can hardly hurt you due to bugs, and those which destroy you in a fair 1v1. I say a fair 1v1 because battles are very easy to exploit, especially as a Pegasus, And once you learn just how broken flight really is, you will never die unintentionally. In hindsight, battles were completely pointless. I had no reason to collect gems, swords, bits, or anything else an enemy might drop. Had I wanted to make a full armor set, I found that the optimum strategy for accumulating wealth is to let other ponies do the dirty work and then to leech off of them. There is literally nothing a player can do to prevent this, since drops aren't tied to battles, and the game does nothing to discourage PvE exploitation. So at this point I've determined that NPCs in combat are both useless. Does that mean that LoE is a bad game? No, not at all. Simply that the redeeming elements are completely independent of the RPG elements. As far as quantifying fun, talking to NPCs, completing quests, and fighting enemies netted 2 out of 10. However, experimenting with glitches, taking part in player-made events, and simply being a pony was fun on its own. I found that one of the hardest things to do, which perhaps requires more skill than anything else currently in the game, is successfully stealing a kill and then absconding with the loot. Normally, I'm a very team-oriented player, but in a game that punishes teamwork, kill stealing is both rewarding and incredibly fun. To conclude, there are a lot of game features that simply don't work, which I'm certain will be fixed sooner or later. But there are also some odd design choices independent of these problems which won't be fixed unless addressed. As a player, hide and seek was more fun than fighting enemies. Dancing with random ponies for no reason was more fun than spending an hour talking to useless NPCs. And fucking around with glitches was more fun than trying to figure out what the point of the game was supposed to be. At present, the game is attempting to be all things to all players, and that's something which it can't possibly deliver, and given how slowly development is proceeding, some triage is necessary. Combat is clearly an afterthought, and while fire-breathing dragons look cool, in the end, they do little to make the game more enjoyable. My personal recommendation, at least in the short term, would be to focus on the social aspects, because this is where the game really shines, and is also where the player base will fill in gaps as they arise. Despite my problems with the engine and design, I had a really good time with the game during most of the open weekend, and once again, a bravo to the map design and graphics teams. Of the issues that I mentioned, there are some problems of critical importance which need to be addressed. That is, for a game with fast-paced combat, the controls need to be much more fluid. And for a game with such a strong social focus, socialization needs to be much easier and supplemented, not hindered, by in-game mechanics. I hope to see that many of the core problems will have been resolved by the next open hosting, and as before, I remain cautiously optimistic about future developments to Legends of Equestria.